All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a look at the massive, complex, and honestly just absolutely fascinating history of the United States. We are going to track how this pretty loose collection of colonies managed to forge themselves into a colossal global superpower. And as we'll see, it was definitely not a smooth ride. They had to navigate some incredibly profound internal divisions, go through rapid, mind-boggling industrialization, and get pulled into major global conflicts along the way. It's really the story of a nation that is just constantly in transition.
Just listen to this quote for a second. It perfectly captures how this nation started as something completely unheard of, a totally unique and evolving entity. Sure, the roots of this civilization were planted in the Old World, but what actually grew out of it, the civil institutions, the republic itself, well, that was as fresh and original as the physical landscape of the continent. It was a grand experiment then, and you know what? It still is.
To actually make sense of this massive timeline, we're going to break down this incredible historical progression by looking at 6 major eras of transformation. Let's start right at the beginning with our first era, foundations of a new nation.
So right after the Revolution, things were actually pretty shaky. The original 13 colonies were legally free, sure, but they were largely undefined. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation in 1781, which frankly was loose and pretty ineffective. To stop the whole thing from just tearing itself apart, forging a real, coherent nationhood required an immediate, intense evolution. Delegates got together at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, led by figures like James Madison and George Washington, and they drafted a completely new framework for a much stronger central government. Fast forward to 1789, and the Bill of Rights is introduced to protect individual liberties.
But here's the catch, and it's a monumental one. This new constitutional republic had a deeply embedded flaw right from the start. As the U.S. kept relentlessly pushing its territory west to the Pacific, acquiring the Louisiana Purchase, Texas, and lands from Mexico, it brought an unresolved foundational tension right to the boiling point. The fierce debate over the spread of slavery practically pushed the whole American experiment to the brink of collapse.
Which brings us to our second era, expansion and civil fracture. You essentially had 2 totally irreconcilable worlds trying to share a single national government. Up in the northern states, society was rapidly industrializing, fueled by mass-mobilized politics and free labor. But then, in stark contrast, you look at the southern states, they were dominated by an agricultural planter elite, where almost all the capital investment and productive labor were laser-focused on the institution of slavery. It was a structural powder keg.
And that tension finally snapped in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected, which deeply politically isolated the South. Literally months later, in April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, and the Civil War exploded. The next 4 years were defined by unprecedented, catastrophic bloodshed. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which officially made ending slavery a core objective of the war. After grueling campaigns by Union General Ulysses S. Grant, Confederate General Robert E. Lee finally surrenders at Appomattox in 1865. So this devastating rupture forced a bloody reconstitution of the Republic. It ended slavery, but it dragged the country right into a highly fraught, painful, and often unsuccessful Reconstruction era.
Emerging from the ashes of that war, we hit our third era, industrial power and social reform.
Just wrap your head around this number for a second. 43. By 1900, the U.S. had 43 cities with a population of over 100,000 people. Want to guess how many there were just 80 years earlier, in 1820? 0. Literally none. It perfectly captures the absolute explosion of the Gilded Age. The U.S. just skyrocketed into an industrial powerhouse, churning out 62% of the world's grain and 40% of its manufactured goods by 1890. It's a staggering leap.
Now, with all that sudden wealth came some really harsh realities. You had massive fortunes being made, but right next door you had horrific, pathological living conditions in these new urban slums. And that sparked a massive wave of pushback, the Progressive Era. People were desperately trying to cure these new societal diseases. You had muckraking journalists exposing corruption, Frances Willard leading the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You've got the social gospel movement building shelters for the working poor, labor unions finally becoming legalized to protect workers, and even the birth of empirical social sciences like sociology, created specifically to gather the data needed to guide these social reforms.
As the 20th century dawns, all of this internal momentum gets thrust onto the world stage in our fourth era, global conflict and superpower status.
Things escalate incredibly fast here. The U.S. mobilizes on a massive scale for World War I in 1917. Then we swing right into the euphoric, electrified culture of the Roaring '20s, which, of course, crashes incredibly hard into the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're talking 25% unemployment. FDR's New Deal drastically expands the federal government to fight that economic crisis. But it was the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that really completely shifted the nation into absolute total wartime production for World War II.
So the U.S. comes out of the monumental devastation of WWI-II not just as a victor, but as the world's sole superpower, now armed with nuclear capabilities. But even with totalitarian regimes conquered abroad, back home the country was highly fragmented. Looming domestic political conflicts and a rampant wave of anti-communism set the stage for a completely unprecedented kind of global tension.
Which brings us seamlessly to our fifth era, the Cold War era.
The globe basically split in two overnight, separated by the Iron Curtain. Looking at the historical consensus neutrally, on one side you had the United States and NATO, positioned as wealthy capitalist democracies, and on the exact opposite side, the Soviet Union and its satellite nations functioning as state-controlled communist states. This intense ideological clash just completely defined global policy for almost 50 years, sparking proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam, and driving a ton of domestic paranoia within the U.S. But while the U.S. was projecting this image of democracy abroad, back home there was a massive, essential fight happening to actually make that true for everyone. Jim Crow laws and racial discrimination were still a harsh, everyday reality. Figures like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Ella Baker spearheaded the civil rights movement. And through sheer determination, boycotts, and massive actions like the '63 March on Washington, they forced the passage of landmark legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and voting rights protections in '65, to finally dismantle legal segregation.
At the exact same time, U.S. foreign policy was triggering an intense domestic backlash. The Vietnam War entirely fractured public consensus. As casualties piled up, an enormous counterculture and anti-war movement exploded across the country. Activists were demanding an immediate end to the bombing, full U.S. withdrawal, the removal of Henry Kissinger's influence, cutting ties with the corrupt South Vietnamese dictatorship, and actual help in reconstructing the region. And this movement went way beyond just foreign policy. It started questioning traditional authority and moral norms across the entire American society.
Then, bam, 1989. The Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union collapses shortly after, and the Cold War ends. The U.S. is suddenly left standing alone in a completely unprecedented position. And it brings up a massive question that we are still dealing with. Can a single superpower maintain its hegemony indefinitely?
And that question ushers us right into our final section, 21st Century Challenges.
Today, we're seeing the nation's institutions tested in real time by incredibly complex crises. In terms of security, the tragic 9/11 attacks completely rewired the government, leading to the Department of Homeland Security and the sprawling war on terror. On the economic front, the loss of a firm global reserve currency and massive overspending have fueled these really unpredictable cycles of boom and bust. And environmentally, well, catalysts dating all the way back to the very first Earth Day in 1970 helped create the EPA and the Clean Air Act, but managing the industrial impact on the climate remains a massively escalating challenge for the 21st century.
The sources point to a really profound structural shift happening right now. As new global powers like China rise, the whole capitalist world economy is shifting beneath our feet. The American system is facing profound societal and economic stress tests. Looking forward, the U.S. is going to have to navigate a major transition, potentially having to reconcile a shift towards second-tier global status, all while trying to hold on to and maintain its unique, deep-rooted democratic systems.
But here's a crazy thought to end on. Despite all this vast, tumultuous, deeply complex history we've just covered, in the grand scheme of civilizations, the United States is historically still in its youth. It's compared to an 18-year-old standing on the balcony of existence, filled with this bounding hope, but simultaneously clouded by 1,000 doubts about what the future holds.
So, I'm going to leave you with this to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As the nation stands at the threshold of numberless futures, facing greater promise but also potential catastrophe than ever before, who shall dare express the course or destinies of that youth? The ongoing American experiment is absolutely far from over. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep exploring.